Book 4, Chapter 4, Part 2 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 4, What Life Is. Chapter 4. End of Sophia. Part 2. 3. Dick Povey kept his word. At 5:15 he drew up in front of number 49 Deansgate, Manchester. "There you are," he said, not without pride. "Now, we'll come back in about a couple of hours or so, just to take your orders, whatever they are." He was very comforting, with his suggestion that in him Sophia had a sure support in the background. Without many words, Sophia went straight into the shop. It looked like a jeweller's shop, and a shop for bargains generally. Only the conventional sign over a side entrance showed that at heart it was a pawnbroker's. Mr. Till Balderow did a nice business in the Five Towns, and in other centres near Manchester, by selling silverware second-hand, or nominally second-hand, to persons who wished to make presents to other persons or to themselves. He would send anything by post on approval. Occasionally he came to the Five Towns, and he had once, several years before, met Constance. They had talked. He was the son of a cousin of the late great and wealthy Balderow, sleeping partner in Birkinshaw's, and Gerald's uncle. It was from Constance that he had learnt of Sophia's return to Bursley. Constance had often remarked to Sophia what a superior man Mr. Till Balderow was. The shop was narrow and lofty. It seemed like a menagerie for trapped silverware. In glass cases, right up to the dark ceiling, silver vessels and instruments of all kinds lay confined. The top of the counter was a glass prison containing dozens of gold watches, together with snuff-boxes, enamels, and other antiquities. The front of the counter was also glazed, showing vases and large pieces of porcelain. A few pictures in heavy gold frames were perched about. There was a case of umbrellas with elaborate handles and rich tassels. There were a couple of statuettes. The counter on the customer's side ended in a glass screen, on which were the words "Private Office." On the seller's side the prospect was closed by a vast safe. A tall young man was fumbling in this safe. Two women sat on customers' chairs, leaning against the crystal counter. The young man came towards them from the safe, bearing a tray. "How much is that goblet?" asked one of the women, raising her parasol dangerously among such fragility, and pointing to one object among many in a case high up from the ground. "That, madam?" "Yes." £35. The young man disposed his tray on the counter. It was packed with more gold watches, adding to the extraordinary glitter and shimmer of the shop. He chose a small watch from the regiment. "Now, this is something I can recommend," he said. "It's made by Cuthbert Butler of Blackburn. I can guarantee you that for 5 years." He spoke as though he were the accredited representative of the Bank of England, with calm and absolute assurance. The effect upon Sophia was mysteriously soothing. She felt that she was among honest men. The young man raised his head towards her with a questioning, deferential gesture. "Can I see Mr. Balderow?" she asked. "Mrs. Scales." The young man's face changed instantly to a sympathetic comprehension. "Yes, madam, I'll fetch him at once," said he, and he disappeared behind the safe. The two customers discussed the watch. Then the door opened in the glass screen, and a portly, middle-aged man showed himself. He was dressed in a blue broadcloth, with a turned-down collar and a small black tie. His waistcoat displayed a plain but heavy gold watch-chain, and his cuff-links were of plain gold. His eyeglasses were gold-rimmed. He had grey hair, beard, and moustache, but on the backs of his hands grew a light brown hair. His appearance was strangely mild, dignified, and confidence-inspiring. He was, in fact, one of the most respected tradesmen in Manchester. He peered forward, looking over his eyeglasses, which he then took off, holding them up in the air by their short handle. Sophia had approached him. "Mrs. Scales?" he said, in a very quiet, very benevolent voice. Sophia nodded. "Please come this way." He took her hand, squeezing it commiseratingly, and drew her into the sanctum. "I didn't expect you so soon," he said. "I looked up the trains, and I didn't see how you could get here before 6." Sophia explained. He led her further, through the private office, into a sort of parlour, and asked her to sit down. And he too sat down. Sophia waited, as it were, like a suitor. "I'm afraid I've got bad news for you, Mrs. Scales," he said, still in that mild, benevolent voice. "He's dead?" Sophia asked. Mr. Tilbalderow nodded. "He's dead. I may as well tell you that he had passed away before I telegraphed. It all happened very, very suddenly." He paused. "Very, very suddenly." "Yes," said Sophia weakly. She was conscious of a profound sadness, which was not grief, though it resembled grief. And she also had a feeling that she was responsible to Mr. Tilbalderow for anything untoward that might have occurred to him by reason of Gerald. "Yes," said Mr. Tilbalderow, deliberately and softly. "He came in last night, just as we were closing. We had very heavy rain here. Don't know how it was with you. He was wet, in a dreadful state, simply dreadful. Of course I didn't recognise him. I'd never seen him before, so far as my recollection goes. He asked me if I were the son of Mr. Tilbalderow that had this shop in 1866. I said I was. 'Well,' he says, 'you're the only connection I've got. My name's Gerald Scales. My mother was your father's cousin. Can you do anything for me?' he says. I could see he was ill. I had him in here. When I found he couldn't eat nor drink, I thought I'd happen better send for the doctor. The doctor got him to bed. He passed away at 1 o'clock this afternoon. I was very sorry my wife wasn't here to look after things a bit better, but she's at Southport, not well at all." "What was it?" Sophia asked briefly. Mr. Balderow indicated the enigmatic. "Exhaustion, I suppose," he replied. "He's here?" demanded Sophia, lifting her eyes to possible bedrooms. "Yes," said Mr. Balderow. "I suppose you would wish to see him?" "Yes," said Sophia. "You haven't seen him for a long time, your sister told me," Mr. Balderow murmured sympathetically. "Not since '70," said Sophia. Eh dear!" ejaculated Mr. Balderow. "I fear it has been a sad business for you, Mrs. Scales. Not since '70," he sighed. "You must take it as well as you can. I'm not one that talks much, but I sympathise with you. I do that. I wish my wife had been here to receive you." Tears came into Sophia's eyes. "Nay, nay," he said. "You must bear up now." "It's you that make me cry," said Sophia gratefully. "You were very good to take him in. It must have been exceedingly trying for you." "Oh," he protested, "you mustn't talk like that. I couldn't leave a Balderow on the pavement, and an old man at that. Oh, to think, if he'd only managed to please his uncle, he might have been one of the richest men in Lancashire. But then there's been no Balderow Institute at Strangeways," he added. They both sat silent for a moment. "Will you come now, or will you wait a bit?" asked Mr. Balderow gently. "Just as you wish. I'm sorry as my wife's away, that I am." "I'll come now," said Sophia firmly, but she was stricken. He conducted her up a short dark flight of stairs, which gave on a passage, and at the end of the passage was a door ajar. He pushed the door open. "I'll leave you for a moment," he said, always in the same very restrained tone. "You'll find me downstairs there if you want me." And he moved away with hushed, deliberate tread. Sophia went into the room, of which the white blind was drawn. She appreciated Mr. Balderow's consideration in leaving her. She was trembling. But when she saw in the pale gloom the face of an aged man peeping out from under a white sheet on a naked mattress, she started back, trembling no more, rather transfixed into an absolute rigidity. That was no conventional expected shock that she had received. It was a genuine unforeseen shock, the most violent she had ever had. In her mind she had not pictured Gerald as a very old man. She knew that he was old. She said to herself that he must be very old, well over 70. But she had not pictured him. This face on the bed was painfully, pitiably old. A withered face, with the shiny skin all drawn into wrinkles. The stretched skin under the jaw was like the skin of a plucked fowl. The cheekbones stood up, and below them were deep hollows, almost like egg cups. A short, scraggy white beard covered the lower part of the face. The hair was scanty, irregular, and quite white. A little white hair grew in the ears. The shut mouth obviously hid toothless gums, for the lips were sucked in. The eyelids were as if pasted down over the eyes, fitting them like kid. All the skin was extremely pallid. The body, whose outlines were clear under the sheet, was very small, thin, shrunk, pitiable as the face. And on the face was a general expression of final fatigue, of tragic and acute exhaustion, such as made Sophia pleased that the fatigue and exhaustion had been assuaged in rest, while all the time she kept thinking to herself horribly, "Oh, how tired he must have been!" Sophia then experienced a pure and primitive emotion, uncoloured by any moral or religious quality. She was not sorry that Gerald had wasted his life, nor that he was a shame to his years and to her. The manner of his life was of no importance. What affected her was that he had once been young, and that he had grown old, and was now dead. That was all. Youth and vigour had come to that. Youth and vigour always come to that. Everything came to that. He had ill-treated her. He had abandoned her. He had been a devious rascal. But how trivial were such accusations against him! The whole of her huge and bitter grievance against him fell to pieces and crumbled. She saw him young and proud and strong, as for instance when he had kissed her lying on the bed in that London hotel, she forgot the name, in 1866. And now he was old and worn and horrible and dead. It was the riddle of life that was puzzling and killing her. By the corner of her eye, reflected in the mirror of a wardrobe near the bed, she glimpsed a tall, forlorn woman, who had once been young and now was old, who had once exulted in abundant strength and trodden proudly on the neck of circumstance, and now was old. He and she had once loved and burned and quarrelled in the glittering and scornful pride of youth, but time had worn them out. Yet a little while, she thought, and I shall be lying on a bed like that. And what shall I have lived for? What is the meaning of it? The riddle of life itself was killing her, and she seemed to drown in a sea of inexpressible sorrow. Her memory wandered hopelessly among those past years. She saw Chirac with his wistful smile. She saw him whipped over the roof of the Gare du Nord at the tail of a balloon. She saw old Niepce. She felt his lecherous arm round her. She was as old now as Niepce had been then. Could she excite lust now? Ah, the irony of such a question! To be young and seductive, to be able to kindle a man's eye, that seemed to her the sole thing desirable. Once she had been so. Niepce must certainly have been dead for years. Niepce, the obstinate and hopeful voluptuary, was nothing but a few bones in a coffin now. She was acquainted with affliction in that hour. All that she had previously suffered sank into insignificance by the side of that suffering. She turned to the veiled window and idly pulled the blind and looked out. Huge red and yellow cars were swimming in thunder along Deansgate. Lorries jolted and rattled. The people of Manchester hurried along the pavements, apparently unconscious that all their doings were in vain. Yesterday he too had been in Deansgate, hungry for life, hating the idea of death. What a figure he must have made! Her heart dissolved in pity for him. She dropped the blind. "My life has been too terrible,"
she thought. I wish I was dead. I have been through too much. It's monstrous, and I cannot stand it. I don't want to die, but I wish I was dead. There was a discreet knock on the door. "Come in," she said, in a calm, resigned, cheerful voice. The sound had recalled her with the swiftness of a miracle to the unconquerable dignity of human pride. Mr. Tilbalderow entered. "I should like you to come downstairs and drink a cup of tea," he said. He was a marvel of tact and good nature. "My wife is unfortunately not here, and the house is rather at sixes and sevens, but I've sent out for some tea." She followed him downstairs into the parlour. He poured out a cup of tea. "I was forgetting," she said. "I'm forbidden tea. I mustn't drink it." She looked at the cup, tremendously tempted. She longed for tea. An occasional transgression could not harm her. But no, she would not drink it. "Then what can I get you?" "If I could have just milk and water," she said meekly. Mr. Balderow emptied the cup into the slop basin, and began to fill it again. "Did he tell you anything?" she asked, after a considerable silence. "Nothing," said Mr. Balderow, in his low, soothing tones. "Nothing, except that he had come from Liverpool. Judging from his shoes, I should say he must have walked a good bit of the way." "At his age," murmured Sophia, touched. "Yes," sighed Mr. Balderow. "He must have been in great straits. You know, he could scarcely talk at all. By the way, here are his clothes. I've had them put aside." Sophia saw a small pile of clothes on a chair. She examined the suit, which was still damp, and its woeful shabbiness pained her. The linen collar was nearly black, its stud of bone. As for the boots, she had noticed such boots on the feet of tramps. She wept now. These were the clothes of him who had once been a dandy, living at the rate of £50 a week. "No luggage or anything, of course?" she muttered. "No," said Mr. Balderow. "In the pockets there was nothing whatever but this." He went to the mantelpiece and picked up a cheap cracked letter case, which Sophia opened. In it were a visiting card, "Senorita Clemencia Borgia," and a billhead of the Hotel of the Holy Spirit, Concepcion del Uruguay, on the back of which a lot of figures had been scrawled. "One would suppose," said Mr. Balderow, "that he had come from South America." "Nothing else?" "Nothing." Gerald's soul had not been compelled to abandon much in the haste of its flight. A servant announced that Mrs. Scales's friends were waiting for her outside in the motor car. Sophia glanced at Mr. Tilbalderow with an exacerbated anxiety on her face. "Surely they don't expect me to go back with them tonight," she said. "And look at all there is to be done." Mr. Tilbalderow's kindness was then redoubled. "You can do nothing for him now," he said. "Tell me your wishes about the funeral. I will arrange everything. Go back to your sister tonight. She'll be nervous about you. And return tomorrow or the day after. No, it's no trouble, I assure you." She yielded. Thus, towards 8 o'clock, when Sophia had eaten a little under Mr. Balderow's superintendence, and the pawn shop was shut up, the motor car started again for Bursley, Lily Hall being beside her lover, and Sophia alone in the body of the car. Sophia had told them nothing of the nature of her mission. She was incapable of talking to them. They saw that she was in a condition of serious mental disturbance. Under cover of the noise of the car, Lily said to Dick that she was sure Mrs. Scales was ill, and Dick, putting his lips together, replied that he meant to be in King Street at 9:30 at the latest. From time to time Lily surreptitiously glanced at Sophia, a glance of apprehensive inspection, or smiled at her silently, and Sophia vaguely responded to the smile. In half an hour they had escaped from the ring of Manchester, and were on the county roads of Cheshire, polished, flat, sinuous. It was the season of the year when there is no night, only daylight and twilight, when the last silver of dusk remains obstinately visible for hours. And in the open country, under the melancholy arch of evening, the sadness of the earth seemed to possess Sophia anew. Only then did she realise the intensity of the ordeal through which she was passing. To the south of Congleton, one of the tyres softened. Immediately after, Dick had lighted his lamps. He stopped the car and got down again. They were 2 miles, Astbury, the nearest village. He had just, with the resignation of experience, reached for the tool bag, when Lily exclaimed, "Is she asleep, or what?" Sophia was not asleep, but she was apparently not conscious. It was a difficult and trying situation for two lovers. Their voices changed momentarily to the tone of alarm and consternation, and then grew firm again. Sophia showed life, but not reason. Lily could feel the poor old lady's heart. "Well, there's nothing for it," said Dick briefly, when all their efforts failed to rouse her. "What shall you do?" "Go straight home as quick as I can on 3 tyres. We must get her over to this side, and you must hold her. Like that we shall keep the weight off the other side." He pitched back the tool bag into its box. Lily admired his decision. It was in this order, no longer under the spell of the changing beauty of nocturnal landscapes, that they finished the journey. Constance had opened the door before the car came to a stop in the gloom of King Street. The young people considered that she bore the shock well, though the carrying into the house of Sophia's inert, twitching body, with its hat forlornly awry, was a sight to harrow a soul sturdier than Constance. When that was done, Dick said curtly, "I'm off. You stay here, of course." "Where are you going?" asked Lily. "Doctor," snapped Dick, hobbling rapidly down the steps.
4. The extraordinary violence of the turn in affairs was what chiefly struck Constance, though it did not overwhelm her. Less than 12 hours before, nay, scarcely 6 hours before, she and Sophia had been living their placid and monotonous existence, undisturbed by anything worse than the indisposition or death of dogs, or the perversity of a servant. And now, the menacing Gerald Scales having reappeared, Sophia's form lay mysterious and affrightening on the sofa, and she and Lily Hall, a girl whom she had not met till that day, were staring at Sophia, side by side, intimately sharing the same alarm. Constance rose to the crisis. She no longer had Sophia's energy and decisive peremptoriness to depend on, and the Baines in her was awakened. All her daily troubles sank away to their proper scale of unimportance. Neither the young woman nor the old knew what to do. They could loosen clothes, vainly offer restoratives to the smitten mouth. That was all. Sophia was not unconscious, as could be judged from her eyes, but she could not speak, nor make signs. Her body was frequently convulsed. So the two women waited, and the servant waited in the background. The sight of Sophia had effected an astonishing transformation in Maud. Maud was a changed girl. Constance could not recognise, in her eager deferential anxiety to be of use, the pert naughtiness of the minx. She was altered as a wanton of the Middle Ages would have been altered by some miraculous visitation. It might have been the turning point in Maud's career. Dr Stirling arrived in less than 10 minutes. Dick Povey had had the wit to look for him at the Federation meeting at the town hall, and the advent of the doctor and Dick, noisily, at breakneck speed in the car, provided a second sensation. The doctor inquired quickly what had occurred. Nobody could tell him anything. Constance had already confided to Lily Hall the reason of the visit to Manchester, but that was the extent of her knowledge. Not a single person in Bursley, except Sophia, knew what had happened in Manchester. But Constance conjectured that Gerald Scales was dead, or Sophia would never have returned so soon. Then the doctor suggested that, on the contrary, Gerald Scales might be out of danger, and all of them pictured to themselves this troubling Gerald Scales, this dark and sinister husband that had caused such a violent upheaval. Meanwhile the doctor was at work. He sent Dick Povey to knock up Critchlow's, if the shop should be closed, and obtain a drug. Then, after a time, he lifted Sophia, just as she was, like a bundle on his shoulder, and carried her single-handed upstairs to the second floor. He had recently been giving a course of instruction to enthusiasts of the St. John's Ambulance Association in Bursley. The feat had an air of the superhuman. Above all else, it remained printed on Constance's mind, the burly doctor treading delicately and carefully on the crooked, creaking stairs, his precautions against damaging Sophia by brusque contacts, his stumble at the 2 steps in the middle of the corridor.
Sophia's horribly limp head and loosened hair, and then the tender placing of her on the bed, and the doctor's long breath and flourish of his large handkerchief, all that under the crude lights and shadows of gas jets. The doctor was nonplussed. Constance gave him a second-hand account of Sophia's original attack in Paris, roughly as she had heard it from Sophia. He had once said that it could not have been what the French doctor had said it was. Constance shrugged her shoulders. She was not surprised. For her there was necessarily something of the charlatan about a French doctor. She said she only knew what Sophia had told her. After a time Dr. Stirling determined to try electricity, and Dick Povey drove him up to the surgery to fetch his apparatus. The women were left alone again. Constance was very deeply impressed by Lily Hall's sensible, sympathetic attitude. "Whatever I should have done without Miss Lily, I don't know," she used to exclaim afterwards. Even Maud was beyond praise. It seemed to be the middle of the night when Dr. Stirling came back, but it was barely 11 o'clock, and people were only just returning from Hanbridge Theatre and Hanbridge Music Hall. The use of the electrical apparatus was a dead spectacle. Sophia's inertness under it was agonizing. They waited, as it were breathless, for the result, and there was no result. Both injections and electricity had entirely failed to influence the paralysis of Sophia's mouth and throat. Everything had failed. "Nothing to do but wait a bit," said the doctor quietly. They waited in the chamber. Sophia seemed to be in a kind of coma. The distortion of her handsome face was more marked as time passed. The doctor spoke now and then in a low voice. He said that the attack had ultimately been determined by cold produced by rapid motion in the automobile. Dick Povey whispered that he must run over to Hanbridge and let Lily's parents know that there was no cause for alarm on her account, and that he would return at once. He was very devoted. On the landing outside the bedroom, the doctor murmured to him, "U.P.," and Dick nodded. They were great friends. At intervals the doctor, who never knew when he was beaten, essayed new methods of dealing with Sophia's case. New symptoms followed. It was 12:30 when, after gazing with prolonged intensity at the patient, and having tested her mouth and heart, he rose slowly and looked at Constance. "It's over," said Constance, and he very slightly moved his head. "Come downstairs, please," he enjoined her. In a pause that ensued, Constance was amazingly courageous. The doctor was very solemn and very kind. Constance had never before seen him to such heroic advantage. He led her with infinite gentleness out of the room. There was nothing to stay for. Sophia had gone. Constance wanted to stay by Sophia's body, but it was the rule that the stricken should be led away. The doctor observed this classic rule, and Constance felt that he was right and that she must obey. Lily Hall followed. The servant, learning the truth by the intuition accorded to primitive natures, burst into loud sobs, yelling that Sophia had been the most excellent mistress that servant ever had. The doctor angrily told her not to stand blubbering there, but to go into her kitchen and shut the door if she couldn't control herself. All his accumulated nervous agitation was discharged on Maud like a thunderclap. Constance continued to behave wonderfully. She was the admiration of the doctor and Lily Hall. Then Dick Povey came back. It was settled that Lily should pass the night with Constance. At last the doctor and Dick departed together, the doctor undertaking the mortuary arrangements. Maud was hunted to bed. Early in the morning Constance rose up from her own bed. It was 5 o'clock, and there had been daylight for 2 hours already. She moved noiselessly and peeped over the foot of the bed at the sofa. Lily was quietly asleep there, breathing with the softness of a child. Lily would have deemed that she was a very mature woman who had seen life and much of it. Yet to Constance her face and attitude had the exquisite quality of a child's. She was not precisely a pretty girl, but her features, the candid expression of her disposition, produced an impression that was akin to that of beauty. Her abandonment was complete. She had gone through the night unscathed, and was now renewing herself in calm, oblivious sleep. Her ingenuous girlishness was apparent then. It seemed as if all her wise and sweet behaviour of the evening could have been nothing but so many imitative gestures. It seemed impossible that a being so young and fresh could have really experienced the mood of which her gestures had been the expression. Her strong virginal simplicity made Constance vaguely sad for her. Creeping out of the room, Constance climbed to the second floor in her dressing gown, and entered the other chamber. She was obliged to look again upon Sophia's body. Incredible swiftness of calamity! Who could have foreseen it? Constance was less desolated than numbed. She was as yet only touching the fringe of her bereavement. She had not begun to think of herself. She was drenched as she gazed at Sophia's body, not by pity for herself, but by compassion for the immense disaster of her sister's life. She perceived fully now for the first time the greatness of that disaster. Sophia's charm and Sophia's beauty, what profit had they been to their owner? She saw pictures of Sophia's career, distorted and grotesque images formed in her untravelled mind from Sophia's own rare and compressed recitals. What a career! A brief passion, and then nearly 30 years in a boarding house. And Sophia had never had a child, had never known either the joy or the pain of maternity. She had never even had a true home, till in her sterile splendour she came to Bursley. And she had ended thus. This was the piteous, ignominious end of Sophia's wondrous gifts of body and soul. Hers had not been a life at all. And the reason? It is strange how fate persists in justifying the harsh generalization of Puritan morals, of the morals in which Constance had been brought up by her stern parents. Sophia had sinned. It was therefore inevitable that she should suffer. An adventure such as she had, in wicked and capricious pride, undertaken with Gerald Scales, could not conclude otherwise than it had concluded. It could have brought nothing but evil. There was no getting away from these verities, thought Constance, and she was to be excused for thinking that all modern progress and cleverness was as naught, and that the world would be forced to return upon its steps and start again in the path which it had left. Up to within a few days of her death, people had been wont to remark that Mrs. Scales looked as young as ever, and that she was as bright and energetic as ever. And truly, regarding Sophia from a little distance, that handsome oval, that erect carriage of a slim body, that challenging eye, no one would have said that she was in her 60th year. But look at her now, with her twisted face, her sightless orbs, her worn skin. She did not seem 60, but 70. She was like something used, exhausted, and thrown aside. Yes, Constance's heart melted in an anguished pity for that stormy creature, and mingled with the pity was a stern recognition of the handiwork of divine justice. To Constance's lips came the same phrase as had come from the lips of Samuel Povey on a different occasion: "God is not mocked." The ideas of her parents and her grandparents had survived intact in Constance. It is true that Constance's father would have shuddered in heaven could he have seen Constance solitarily playing cards of a night. But in spite of cards, and of a son who never went to chapel, Constance, under the various influences of destiny, had remained essentially what her father had been. Not in her was the force of evolution manifest. There are thousands such. Lily, awake and reclothed, with that unreal mien of a grown and comprehending woman, stepped quietly into the room, searching for the poor old thing, Constance. The layer out had come. By the first post was delivered a letter addressed to Sophia by Mr. Till Balderow. From its contents, the death of Gerald Scales was clear. There seemed then to be nothing else for Constance to do. What had to be done was done for her, and stronger wills than hers put her to bed. Cyril was telegraphed for. Mr. Critchlow called, Mrs. Critchlow following. A fussy infliction, but useful in certain matters. Mr. Critchlow was not allowed to see Constance. She could hear his high, grating voice in the corridor. She had to lie calm, and the sudden tranquillity seemed strange after the feverish violence of the night. Only 24 hours since, and she had been worrying about the death of a dog. With the body crying for sleep, she dozed off, thoughts of the mystery of life merging into the incoherence of dreams. The news was abroad in the square before 9 o'clock. There were persons who had witnessed the arrival of the motor car and the transfer of Sophia to the house. Untruthful rumours had spread as to the manner of Gerald Scales's death. Some said that he had dramatically committed suicide. But the town, though titillated, was not moved as it would have been moved by a similar event 20 years, or even 10 years, earlier. Times had changed in Bursley. Bursley was more sophisticated than in the old days. Constance was afraid lest Cyril, despite the seriousness of the occasion, might exhibit his customary tardiness in coming. She had long since learnt not to rely upon him. But he came the same evening. His behaviour was in every way perfect. He showed quiet but genuine grief for the death of his aunt, and he was a model of consideration for his mother. Further, he at once assumed charge of all the arrangements in regard to both Sophia and to her husband. Constance was surprised at the ease which he displayed in the conduct of practical affairs, and the assurance with which he gave orders. She had never seen him direct anything before. He said, indeed, that he had never directed anything before, but that there appeared to him to be no difficulties. Whereas Constance had figured a tiresome series of varied complications. As to the burial of Sophia, Cyril was vigorously in favour of an absolutely private funeral, that is to say, a funeral at which none but himself should be present. He seemed to have a passionate objection to any sort of parade. Constance agreed with him, but she said that it would be impossible not to invite Mr. Critchlow, Sophia's trustee, and that if Mr. Critchlow were invited, certain others must be invited. Cyril asked, "Why impossible?" Constance said, "Because it would be impossible, because Mr. Critchlow would be hurt." Cyril asked, "What does it matter if he is hurt?" and suggested that Mr. Critchlow would get over his damage. Constance grew more serious. The discussion threatened to be warm. Suddenly Cyril yielded. "All right, Mrs. Plover, all right. It shall be exactly as you choose," he said in a gentle, humouring tone. He had not called her Mrs. Plover for years. She thought the hour badly chosen for verbal pleasantry, but he was so kind that she made no complaint. Thus there were 6 people at Sophia's funeral, including Mr. Critchlow. No refreshments were offered. The mourners separated at the church. When both funerals were accomplished, Cyril sat down and played the harmonium softly, and said that it had kept well in tune. He was extraordinarily soothing. He had now reached the age of 33. His habits were as industrious as ever, his preoccupation with his art as keen. But he had achieved no fame, no success. He earned nothing, living in comfort on an allowance from his mother. He seldom spoke of his plans, and never of his hopes. He had, in fact, settled down into a dilettante, having learnt gently to scorn the triumphs which he lacked the force to win. He imagined that industry and a regular existence were sufficient justification in themselves for any man's life. Constance had dropped the habit of expecting him to astound the world. He was rather grave and precise in manner, courteous and tepid, with a touch of condescension towards his environment, as though he were continually permitting the perspicacious to discern that he had nothing to learn, if the truth were known. His humour had assumed a modified form. He often smiled to himself. He was unexceptionable. On the day after Sophia's funeral, he set to work to design a simple stone for his aunt's tomb. He said he could not tolerate the ordinary gravestone, which always looked to him as if the wind might blow it over, thus negativing the idea of solidity. His mother did not in the least understand him. She thought the lettering of his tombstone affected and finicking, but she let it pass without comment, being secretly very flattered that he should have deigned to design a stone at all. Sophia had left all her money to Cyril, and had made him the sole executor of her will. This arrangement had been agreed with Constance. The sisters thought it was the best plan. Cyril ignored Mr. Critchlow entirely, and went to a young lawyer at Hanbridge, a friend of his and of Matthew Peel Swinnerton's. Mr. Critchlow, aged and unaccustomed to interference, had to render accounts of his trusteeship to this young man, and was incensed. The estate was proved at over £35,000. In the main, Sophia had been careful, and had even been parsimonious. She had often told Constance that they ought to spend money much more freely, and she had had a few brief fits of extravagance. But the habit of stern thrift, begun in 1870 and practised without any intermission till she came to England in 1897, had been too strong for her theories. The squandering of money pained her, and she could not, in her age, devise expensive tastes. Cyril showed no emotion whatever on learning himself the inheritor of £35,000. He did not seem to care. He spoke of the sum as a millionaire might have spoken of it. In justice to him, it is to be said that he cared nothing for wealth, except in so far as wealth could gratify his eye and ear, trained to artistic voluptuousness. But for his mother's sake, and for the sake of Bursley, he might have affected a little satisfaction. His mother was somewhat hurt. His behaviour caused her to revert in meditation again and again to the futility of Sophia's career and the waste of her attributes. She had grown old and hard in joyless years in order to amass this money, which Cyril would spend coldly and ungratefully, never thinking of the immense effort and endless sacrifice which had gone to its collection. He would spend it carelessly as though he had picked it up in the street. As the days went by, and Constance realised her own grief, she also realised more and more the completeness of the tragedy of Sophia's life. Headstrong Sophia had deceived her mother, and for the deception had paid with 30 years of melancholy and the entire frustration of her proper destiny. After haunting Bursley for a fortnight in elegant black, Cyril said, without any warning, one night, "I must go the day after tomorrow, mater." And he told her of a journey to Hungary, which he had long since definitely planned with Matthew Peele Swinnerton, and which could not be postponed, as it comprised business. He had hitherto breathed no word of this. He was as secretive as ever. As to her holiday, he suggested that she should arrange to go away with the Halls and Dick Povey. He approved of Lily Hall and of Dick Povey. Of Dick Povey he said, "He's one of the most remarkable chaps in the Five Towns." And he had the air of having made Dick's reputation. Constance, knowing there was no appeal, accepted the sentence of loneliness. Her health was singularly good. When he was gone, she said to herself, scarcely a fortnight, and Sophia was here, at this table. She would remember every now and then, with a faint shock, that poor, proud, masterful Sophia was dead. End of
Book 4,
Chapter 4.
Book 4
Chapter 5.
of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 4. What Life Is. Chapter 5. End of Constance. 1. When, on a June afternoon about 12 months later, Lily Hall walked into Mrs. Povey's drawing-room overlooking the square, she found a calm, somewhat optimistic old lady, older than her years, which were little more than 60, whose chief enemies were sciatica and rheumatism. The sciatica was a dear enemy of long standing, always affectionately referred to by the forgiving Constance as "my sciatica." The rheumatism was a newcomer, unprivileged, spoken of by its victim apprehensively and yet disdainfully as "this rheumatism." Constance was now very stout. She sat in a low easy chair between the oval table and the window, arrayed in black silk. As the girl Lily came in, Constance lifted her head with a bland smile, and Lily kissed her contentedly. Lily knew that she was a welcome visitor. These two had become as intimate as the difference between their ages would permit. Of the two, Constance was the more frank. Lily, as well as Constance, was in mourning. A few months previously her aged grandfather, Hall the grocer, had died. The second of his two sons, Lily's father, had then left the business established by the brothers at Hanbridge in order to manage, for a time, the parent business in St. Luke's Square. Alderman Hall's death had delayed Lily's marriage. Lily took tea with Constance, or at any rate paid a call, 4 or 5 times a week.
She listened to Constance. Everybody considered that Constance had come splendidly through the dreadful affair of Sophia's death. Indeed, it was observed that she was more philosophic, more cheerful, more sweet than she had been for many years. The truth was that though her bereavement had been the cause of a most genuine and durable sorrow, it had been a relief to her. When Constance was over 50, the energetic and masterful Sophia had burst in upon her lethargic tranquillity, and very seriously disturbed the flow of old habits. Certainly Constance had fought Sophia on the main point and won, but on 100 minor points she had either lost or had not fought. Sophia had been too much for Constance, and it had been only by a wearying expenditure of nervous force that Constance had succeeded in holding a small part of her own against the unconscious domination of Sophia. The death of Mrs. Scales had put an end to all the strain, and Constance had been once again mistress in Constance's house. Constance would never have admitted these facts, even to herself, and no one would ever have dared suggest them to her, for with all her temperamental mildness she had her formidable side. She was slipping a photograph into a plush-covered photograph album. "More photographs?" Lily questioned. She had almost exactly the same benignant smile that Constance had. She seemed to be the personification of gentleness, one of those feather beds that some capricious men occasionally have the luck to marry. She was capable, with a touch of honest, simple stupidity. All her character was displayed in the tone in which she said, "More photographs?" It showed an eager, responsive sympathy with Constance's cult for photographs, also a slight personal fondness for photographs, also a dim perception that a cult for photographs might be carried to the ridiculous, and a kind desire to hide all trace of this perception. The voice was thin, and matched the pale complexion of her delicate face. Constance's eyes had a quizzical gleam behind her spectacles, as she silently held up the photograph for Lily's inspection. Lily, sitting down, lowered the corners of her soft lips when she beheld the photograph, and nodded her head several times, scarce perceptibly. "Her ladyship has just given it to me," whispered Constance. "Indeed," said Lily, with an extraordinary accent. Her ladyship was the last and best of Constance's servants, a really excellent creature of 30, who had known misfortune, and who must assuredly have been sent to Constance by the old watchful Providence. They got on together nearly perfectly. Her name was Mary. After 10 years of turmoil, Constance, in the matter of servants, was now at rest. "Yes," said Constance, "she's named it to me several times about having her photograph taken, and last week I let her go. I told you, didn't I? I always consider her in every way, all her little fancies and everything, and the copies came today. I wouldn't hurt her feelings for anything. You may be sure she'll take a look into the album next time she cleans the room." Constance and Lily exchanged a glance, agreeing that Constance had affably stretched a point in deciding to put the photograph of a servant between the same covers with photographs of her family and friends. It was doubtful whether such a thing had ever been done before. One photograph usually leads to another, and one photograph album to another photograph album. "Pass me that album on the second shelf of the Canterbury, my dear," said Constance. Lily rose vivaciously, as though to see the album on the second shelf of the Canterbury had been the ambition of her life. They sat side by side at the table, Lily turning over the pages. Constance, for all her vast bulk, continually made little nervous movements. Occasionally she would sniff, and occasionally a mysterious noise would occur in her chest. She always pretended that this noise was a cough, and would support the pretence by emitting a real cough immediately after it. "Why," exclaimed Lily, "have I seen that before?" "I don't know, my dear," said Constance. "Have you?" It was a photograph of Sophia, taken a few years previously by a very nice gentleman, whose acquaintance the sisters had made during a holiday in Harrogate. It portrayed Sophia on a knoll, fronting the weather. "It's Mrs. Scales to the life, I can see that," said Lily. "Yes," said Constance. "Whenever there was a wind she always stood like that, and took long deep breaths of it." This recollection of one of Sophia's habits recalled the whole woman to Constance's memory, and drew a picture of her character for the girl who had scarcely known her. It's not like ordinary photographs. There's something special about it," said Lily enthusiastically. "I don't think I ever saw a photograph like that." "I've got another copy of it in my bedroom," said Constance. "I'll give you this one." "Oh, Mrs. Povey, I couldn't think—" "Yes, yes," said Constance, removing the photograph from the page. "Oh, thank you," said Lily. "And that reminds me," said Constance, getting up with great difficulty from her chair. "Can I find anything for you?" Lily asked. "No, no," said Constance, leaving the room. She returned in a moment with her jewel box, a receptacle of ebony with ivory ornamentations. "I've always meant to give you this," said Constance, taking from the box a fine cameo brooch. "I don't seem to fancy wearing it myself, and I should like to see you wearing it. It was mother's. I believe they're coming into fashion again. I don't see why you shouldn't wear it while you're in mourning. They aren't half so strict now about mourning as they used to be." "Truly," murmured Lily ecstatically. They kissed. Constance seemed to breathe out benevolence as with trembling hands she pinned the brooch at Lily's neck. She lavished the warm treasure of her heart on Lily, whom she regarded as an almost perfect girl, and who had become the idol of her latter years. "What a magnificent old watch!" said Lily, as they delved together in the lower recesses of the box. "And the chain to it." "That was father's," said Constance. "He always used to swear by it. When it didn't agree with the town hall, he used to say, 'Then the town hall's wrong.' And it is curious that the town hall was wrong. You know the town hall clock has never been a good timekeeper. I've been thinking of giving that watch and chain to Dick." "Have you?" said Lily. "Yes. It's just as good as it was when father wore it. My husband would never wear it. He preferred his own. He had little fancies like that. And Cyril takes after his father." She spoke in her dry tone. "I've almost decided to give it to Dick. That is, if he behaves himself. Is he still on with this ballooning?" Lily smiled guiltily. "Oh, yes." "Well," said Constance, "I never heard the like. If he's been up and come down safely, that ought to be enough for him. I wonder you let him do it, my dear." "But how can I stop him? I've no control over him." "But do you mean to say that he'd still do it if you told him seriously you didn't want him to?" "Yes," said Lily, and added, "so I shan't tell him." Constance nodded her head, musing over the secret nature of men. She remembered too well the cruel obstinacy of Samuel, who had nevertheless loved her. And Dick Povey was 1,000 times more bizarre than Samuel. She saw him vividly, a little boy, whizzing down King Street on a bone shaker, and his cap flying off. Afterwards it had been motor cars. Now it was balloons. She sighed. She was struck by the profound instinctive wisdom just enunciated by the girl. "Well," she said, "I shall see. I've not made up my mind yet. What's the young man doing this afternoon, by the way?" "He's gone to Birmingham to try to sell 2 motor lorries. He won't be back home till late. He's coming over here tomorrow." It was an excellent illustration of Dick Povey's methods that at this very moment Lily heard in the square the sound of a motor car, which happened to be Dick's car. She sprang up to look. "Why," she cried, flushing, "here he is now!" Bless us," muttered Constance, closing the box. When Dick, having left his car in King Street, limped tempestuously into the drawing-room, galvanizing it by his abundant vitality into a new life, he cried joyously, "Sold my lorries! Sold my lorries!" And he exclaimed that by a charming accident he had disposed of them to a chance buyer in Hanbridge just before starting for Birmingham. So he had telephoned to Birmingham that the matter was off, and then, being at a loose end, he had come over to Bursley in search of his betrothed. At Hull's shop they had told him that she was with Mrs. Povey. Constance glanced at him, impressed by his jolly air of success. He seemed exactly like his breezy and self-confident advertisements in the Signal. He was absolutely pleased with himself. He triumphed over his limp, that ever-present reminder of a tragedy. Who would dream to look at his blonde, laughing, scintillating face, astonishingly young for his years, that he had once passed through such a night as that on which his father had killed his mother, while he lay immovable and cursing with a broken knee in bed? Constance had heard all about that scene from her husband, and she paused in wonder at the contrasting hazards of existence. Dick Povey brought his hands together with a resounding smack, and then rubbed them rapidly. "And a good price too!" he exclaimed blithely. "Mrs. Povey, I don't mind telling you that I have netted £70 odd this afternoon." Lily's eyes expressed her proud joy. "I hope pride won't have a fall," said Constance, with a calm smile, out of which peeped a hint of rebuke. "That's what I hope. I must just go and see about tea." "I can't stay for tea, really," said Dick. "Of course you can," said Constance positively. "Suppose you'd been at Birmingham. It's weeks since you stayed to tea." "Oh, well, thanks," Dick yielded, rather snubbed. "Can't I save you a journey, Mrs. Povey?" Lily asked, eagerly thoughtful. "No, thank you, my dear. There are one or two little things that need my attention." And Constance departed with her jewel box. Dick, having assured himself that the door was closed, assaulted Lily with a kiss. "Been here long?" he inquired. "About an hour and a half." "Glad to see me?" "Oh, Dick!" she protested. "The old lady's in one of her humours, eh?" "No, no. Only she was just talking about balloons. You know, she's very much up in arms." "You ought to keep her off balloons. Balloons may be the ruin of her wedding present to us, my child." "Dick, how can you talk like that? It's all very well saying I ought to keep her off balloons. You try to keep her off balloons when once she begins. And see,
What started her?
she said she was thinking of giving you old Mr. Baines's gold watch and chain, if you behaved yourself."
"Thank you for nothing," said Dick. "I don't want it."
"Have you seen it?"
Have I seen it? I should say I've seen it. She's mentioned it once or twice before."
"Oh, I didn't know."
"I don't see myself carting that thing about. I much prefer my own. What do you think of it?"
"Of course it is rather clumsy," said Lily. "But if she offered it to you, you couldn't refuse it, and you'd simply have to wear it."
"Well, then," said Dick, "I must try to behave myself just badly enough to keep off the watch, but not badly enough to upset her notions about wedding presents."
"Poor old thing,"
Lily murmured compassionately. Then Lily put her hand silently to her neck. "What's that?"
"She's just given it to me."
Dick approached very near to examine the cameo brooch. "Eh," he murmured. It was an adverse verdict, and Lily coincided with it by a lift of the eyebrows. "And I suppose you'll have to wear that," said Dick.
"She values it as much as anything she's got, poor old thing," said Lily. "It belonged to her mother, and she says cameos are coming into fashion again. It really is rather good, you know."
"I wonder where she learnt that," said Dick dryly. "I see you've been suffering from the photographs again."
"Well," said Lily, "I much prefer the photographs to helping her to play Patience. The way she cheats herself, it's too silly.
She stopped. The door, which had after all not been latched, was pushed open, and the antique Fossette introduced herself painfully into the room. Fossette had an affection for Dick Povey. "Well, Methuselah!" he greeted the animal loudly. She could scarcely wag her tail, nor shake the hair out of her dim eyes in order to look up at him. He stooped to pat her.
"That dog does smell," said Lily bluntly.
"What do you expect? What she wants is the least dose of prussic acid. She's a burden to herself."
"It's funny that if you venture to hint to Mrs. Povey that the dog is offensive, she gets quite peppery," said Lily.
"Well, that's very simple," said Dick. "Don't hint, that's all. Hold your nose and your tongue too."
"Dick, I wish you wouldn't be so absurd."
Constance returned into the room, cutting short the conversation. "Mrs. Povey," said Dick, in a voice full of gratitude, "Lily has just been showing me her brooch." He noticed that she paid no heed to him, but passed hurriedly to the window.
"What's amiss in the square?" Constance exclaimed. "When I was in the parlour just now, I saw a man running along Wedgwood Street, and I said to myself, what's amiss?"
Dick and Lily joined her at the window. Several people were hurrying down the square, and then a man came running with a doctor from the market place. All these persons disappeared from view under the window of Mrs. Povey's drawing room, which was over part of Mrs. Critchlow's shop.
As the windows of the shop projected beyond the walls of the house, it was impossible from the drawing-room window to see the pavement in front of the shop. "It must be something on the pavement, or in the shop," murmured Constance. "Oh, ma'am!" said a startled voice behind the three. It was Mary, original of the photograph, who had run unperceived into the drawing-room. "They say as Mrs. Critchlow has tried to commit suicide." Constance started back. Lily went towards her with an instinctive gesture of supporting consolation. "Maria Critchlow tried to commit suicide?" Constance muttered. "Yes, ma'am, but they say she's not done it." "By Jove, I'd better go and see if I can help, hadn't I?" cried Dick Povey, hobbling off, excited and speedy. "Strange, isn't it," he exclaimed afterwards, "how I managed to come in for things? Sheer chance that I was here to day, but it's always like that. Somehow, something extraordinary is always happening where I am." And this too ministered to his satisfaction and to his zest for life. 2. When, in the evening, after all sorts of comings and goings, he finally returned to the old lady and the young one, in order to report the upshot, his demeanour was suitably toned to Constance's mood. The old lady had been very deeply disturbed by the tragedy, which, as she said, had passed under her very feet while she was calmly talking to Lily. The whole truth came out in a short space of time. Mrs. Critchlow was suffering from melancholia. It appeared that for long she had been depressed by the failing trade of the shop, which was none of her fault. The state of the square had steadily deteriorated. Even the vaults were not what they once were. 4 or 5 shops had been shut up, as it were definitely, the landlords having given up hope of discovering serious tenants, and of those kept open the majority were struggling desperately to make ends meet. Only Hall's and a new upstart draper, who had widely advertised his dressmaking department, were really flourishing. The confectionery half of Mr. Brindley's business was disappearing. People would not go to Hanbridge for their bread or for their groceries, but they would go for their cakes. These electric trams had simply carried to Hanbridge the cream and much of the milk of Bursley's retail trade. There were unprincipled tradesmen in Hanbridge ready to pay the car fares of any customer who spent a crown in their establishments. Hanbridge was the geographical centre of the Five Towns, and it was alive to its situation. Useless for Bursley to compete. If Mrs. Critchlow had been a philosopher, if she had known that geography had always made history, she would have given up her enterprise a dozen years ago. But Mrs. Critchlow was merely Maria Insall. She had seen Baines's in its magnificent prime, when Baines's almost conferred a favour on customers in serving them. At the time when she took over the business under the wing of her husband, it was still a good business. But from that instant the tide had seemed to turn. She had fought, and she kept on fighting stupidly. She was not aware that she was fighting against evolution, not aware that evolution had chosen her for one of its victims. She could understand that all the other shops in the square should fail, but not that Baines's should fail. She was as industrious as ever, as good a buyer, as good a seller, as keen for novelties, as economical, as methodical, and yet the returns dropped and dropped. She naturally had no sympathy from Charles, who now took small interest even in his own business, or what was left of it, and who was coldly disgusted at the ultimate cost of his marriage. Charles gave her no money that he could avoid giving her. The crisis had been slowly approaching for years. The assistants in the shop had said nothing, or had only whispered among themselves, but now that the crisis had flowered suddenly into an attempted self-murder, they all spoke at once, and the evidences were pieced together into a formidable proof of the strain which Mrs. Critchlow had suffered. It appeared that for many months she had been depressed and irritable, that sometimes she would sit down in the midst of work and declare, with every sign of exhaustion, that she could do no more. Then, with equal briskness, she would arise and force herself to labour. She did not sleep for whole nights. One assistant related how she had complained of having had no sleep whatever for 4 nights consecutively. She had noises in the ears and a chronic headache. Never very plump, she had grown thinner and thinner, and she was for ever taking pills. This information came from Charles's manager. She had had several outrageous quarrels with the redoubtable Charles, to the stupefaction of all who heard or saw them. Mrs. Critchlow standing up to her husband! Another strange thing was that she thought the bills of several of the big Manchester firms were unpaid, when as a fact they had been paid. Even when shown the receipts she would not be convinced, though she pretended to be convinced. She would recommence the next day. All this was sufficiently disconcerting for female assistants in the drapery. But what could they do? Then Maria Critchlow had gone a step further. She had summoned the eldest assistant to her corner, and had informed her, with all the solemnity of a confession made to assuage a conscience which had been tortured for too long, that she had on many occasions been guilty of sexual irregularity with her late employer, Samuel Povey. There was no truth whatever in this accusation, which everybody, however, took care not to mention to Constance. It merely indicated, perhaps, the secret aspirations of Maria Insult, the Virgin. The assistant was properly scandalised, more by the crudity of Mrs. Critchlow's language than by the alleged sin buried in the past. Goodness knows what the assistant would have done. But 2 hours later, Maria Critchlow tried to commit suicide by stabbing herself with a pair of scissors. There was blood in the shop. With as little delay as possible, she had been driven away to the asylum. Charles Critchlow, enveloped safely in the armour of his senile egotism, had shown no emotion and very little activity. The shop was closed, and as a general draper's it never opened again. That was the end of Baines's. 2 assistants found themselves without a livelihood. The small tumble with the great. Constance's emotion was more than pardonable, it was justified. She could not eat, and Lily could not persuade her to eat. In an unhappy moment Dick Povey mentioned, he never could remember how afterwards, the word federation, and then Constance, from a passive figure of grief, became a menace. She overwhelmed Dick Povey with her anathema of federation, for Dick was a citizen of Hanbridge, where this detestable movement for federation had had its birth. All the misfortunes of St. Luke's Square were due to that great, busy, grasping, unscrupulous neighbour. Had not Hanbridge done enough without wanting to merge all the 5 towns into one town, of which, of course, itself would be the centre? For Constance, Hanbridge was a borough of unprincipled adventurers, bent on ruining the ancient mother of the 5 towns for its own glory and aggrandisement. Let Constance hear no more of federation. Her poor sister Sophia had been dead against federation, and she had been quite right. All really respectable people were against it. The attempted suicide of Mrs. Critchlow sealed the fate of federation and damned it for ever, in Constance's mind. Her hatred of the idea of it was intensified into violent animosity, insomuch that in the result she died a martyr to the cause of Bursley's municipal independence. 3. It was on a muddy day in October that the first great battle for and against federation was fought in Bursley. Constance was suffering severely from sciatica. She was also suffering from disgust with the modern world. Unimaginable things had happened in the square. For Constance, the reputation of the square was eternally ruined. Charles Critchlow, by that strange good fortune which always put him in the right when fairly he ought to have been in the wrong, had let the Baines shop and his own shop and house to the Midland Clothiers Company, which was establishing branches throughout Staffordshire, Warwickshire, Leicestershire, and adjacent counties. He had sold his own chemist's stock and gone to live in a little house at the bottom of King Street. It is doubtful whether he would have consented to retire had not Alderman Hall died earlier in the year, thus ending a long rivalry between the old men for the patriarchate of the square. Charles Critchlow was as free from sentiment as any man, but no man is quite free from it, and the ancient was in a position to indulge sentiment had he chosen. His business was not a source of loss, and he could still trust his skinny hands and peering eyes to make up a prescription. However, the offer of the Midland Clothiers Company tempted him, and as the undisputed father of the square, he left the square in triumph. The Midland Clothiers Company had no sense of the proprieties of trade. Their sole idea was to sell goods. Having possessed themselves of one of the finest sites in a town which, after all was said and done, comprised nearly 40,000 inhabitants, they set about to make the best of that site. They threw the two shops into one, and they caused to be constructed a sign compared to which the spacious old Baines sign was a postcard. They covered the entire frontage with posters of a theatrical description, coloured posters. They occupied the front page of the Signal, and from that pulpit they announced that winter was approaching, and that they meant to sell 10,000 overcoats in their new shop at Bursley at the price of 12 and sixpence each. The tailoring of the world was loudly and coarsely defied to equal the value of those overcoats. On the day of opening they arranged an orchestra or artillery of phonographs upon the leads over the window of that part of the shop which had been Mr. Critchlow's. They also carpeted the square with handbills, and flew flags from their upper stories. The immense shop proved to be full of overcoats. Overcoats were shown in all the three great windows. In one window an overcoat was disposed as a receptacle for water, to prove that the Midland 12 and sixpenny overcoats were impermeable by rain. Overcoats flapped in the two doorways. These devices woke and drew the town, and the town found itself received by bustling male assistants, very energetic and rapid, instead of by demure anaemic virgins. At moments towards evening the shop was populous with custom. The number of overcoats sold was prodigious. On another day the Midland sold trousers in a like manner, but without the phonographs. Unmistakably the Midland had shaken the square, and demonstrated that commerce was still possible to fearless enterprise. Nevertheless, the square was not pleased. The square was conscious of shame, of dignity departed. Constance was divided between pain and scornful wrath. For her, what the Midland had done was to desecrate a shrine. She hated those flags, and those flaring, staring posters on the honest old brick walls, and the enormous gilded sign, and the windows all filled with a monotonous repetition of the same article, and the bustling assistants. As for the phonographs, she regarded them as a grave insult. They had been within 20 feet of her drawing-room window. 12 and sixpenny overcoats! It was monstrous. And equally monstrous was the gullibility of the people. How could an overcoat at 12 and sixpence be good? She remembered the overcoats made and sold in the shop in the time of her father and her husband, overcoats of which the inconvenience was that they would not wear out. The Midland, for Constance, was not a trading concern, but something between a cheap jack and a circus. She could scarcely bear to walk down the square, to such a degree did the ignoble frontage of the Midland offend her eye and outrage her ancestral pride. She even said that she would give up her house. But when, on the 29th of September, she received 6 months' notice, signed in Critchlow's shaky hand, to quit the house, it was wanted for the Midland's manager, the Midland having taken the premises on condition that they might eject Constance if they chose, the blow was an exceedingly severe one. She had sworn to go, but to be turned out of the house of her birth and out of her father's home, that was different. Her pride, injured as it was, had a great deal to support. It became necessary for her to recollect that she was a Baines. She affected magnificently not to care, but she could not refrain from telling all her acquaintances that she was being turned out of her house, and asking them what they thought of that. And when she met Charles Critchlow in the street, she seared him with the heat of her resentment. The enterprise of finding a new house and moving into it loomed before her, gigantic, terrible. The idea of it was alone sufficient to make her ill. Meanwhile, in the matter of federation, preparations for the pitched battle had been going forward, especially in the columns of the Signal, where the scribes of each one of the 5 towns had proved that all the other towns were in the clutch of unscrupulous gangs of self-seekers. After months of argument and recrimination, all the towns except Bursley were either favourable or indifferent to the prospect of becoming a part of the 12th largest town in the United Kingdom. But in Bursley the opposition was strong, and the 12th largest town in the United Kingdom could not spring into existence without the consent of Bursley. The United Kingdom itself was languidly interested in the possibility of suddenly being endowed with a new town of 250,000 inhabitants. The 5 towns were frequently mentioned in the London dailies, and London journalists would write such sentences as "The 5 towns, which are, of course, as everybody knows, Hanbridge, Bursley, Knype, Longshore, and Turnhill." This was renown at last for the most maligned district in the country. And then a cabinet minister had visited the Five Towns, and assisted at an official inquiry, and stated in his hammering style that he meant personally to do everything possible to accomplish the federation of the Five Towns. An incautious remark, which infuriated, while it flattered, the opponents of federation in Bursley. Constance, with many other sensitive persons, asked angrily what right a cabinet minister had to take sides in a purely local affair. But the partiality of the official world grew flagrant. The mayor of Bursley openly proclaimed himself a federationist, though there were a majority of the council against him. Even ministers of religion permitted themselves to think and to express opinions. Well might the indignant old guard imagine that the end of public decency had come. The federationists were very ingenious individuals. They contrived to enrol in their ranks a vast number of leading men. Then they hired the covered market, and put a platform in it, and put all these leading men on the platform, and made them all speak eloquently on the advantages of moving with the times. The meeting was crowded and enthusiastic, and readers of the Signal next day could not but see that the battle was won in advance, and that anti-federation was dead. In the following week, however, the anti-federationists held in the covered market an exactly similar meeting, except that the display of leading men was less brilliant, and demanded of a floor of serried heads whether the old mother of the Five Towns was prepared to put herself into the hands of a crew of highly paid bureaucrats at Hanbridge, and was answered by a wild, defiant "No" that could be heard on Duck Bank. Readers of the Signal next day were fain to see that the battle had not been won in advance. Bursley was lukewarm on the topics of education, slums, water, gas, electricity, but it meant to fight for that mysterious thing, its identity. Was the name of Bursley to be lost to the world? To ask the question was to give the answer. Then dawned the day of battle, the day of the poll, when the burgesses were to indicate plainly, by means of a cross on a voting paper, whether or not they wanted federation. And on this day Constance was almost incapacitated by sciatica. It was a heroic day. The walls of the town were covered with literature, and the streets dotted with motor cars and other vehicles at the service of the voters. The greater number of these vehicles bore large cards with the words "Federation this time," and hundreds of men walked briskly about with circular cards tied to their lapels, as though Bursley had been a racecourse. And these cards, too, had the words "Federation this time." The reference was to a light poll which had been taken several years before, when no interest had been aroused, and the immature project yet defeated by a 6-1 majority. All partisans of federation sported a red ribbon, all anti-federationists sported a blue ribbon. The schools were closed, and the federationists displayed their characteristic lack of scruple in appropriating the children. The federationists, with devilish skill, had hired the Bursley Town Silver Prize Band, an organisation of terrific respectability, and had set it to march, playing through the town, followed by waggonettes crammed with children, who sang "Vote, vote, vote for federation. Don't be stupid, old and slow. We're sure that it will be good for the community. So vote, 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 and make it go." How this performance could affect the decision of grave burgesses at the poll was not apparent, but the anti-federationists feared that it might, and before noon was come they had engaged 2 bands, and had composed in committee the following lyric in reply to the first one: "Down, down, down with federation. As we are, we'd rather stay. When the vote on Saturday's read, federation will be dead. Good old Bursley's sure to win the day." They had also composed another song, entitled "Dear Old Bursley," which, however, they made the fatal error of setting to the music of Auld Lang Syne. The effect was that of a dirge, and it perhaps influenced many voters in favour of the more cheerful party. The anti-federationists, indeed, never regained the mean advantage filched by the unscrupulous federationists with the help of the Silver Prize Band and a few hundred infants. The odds were against the anti-federationists. The mayor had actually issued a letter to the inhabitants, accusing the anti-federationists of unfair methods. This was really too much. The impudence of it knocked the breath out of its victims, and breath is very necessary in a polling contest. The Federationists, as one of their prominent opponents admitted, had it all their own way, dominating both the streets and the walls. And when, early in the afternoon, Mr. Dick Povey sailed over the town in a balloon that was plainly decorated with the crimson of Federation, it was felt that the cause of Bursley's separate identity was for ever lost. Still, Bursley, with the willing aid of the public houses, maintained its gaiety. 4. Towards dusk, a stout old lady with grey hair and a dowdy bonnet and an expensive mantle paused, limping, very slowly along Wedgwood Street and up the Cock Yard towards the Town Hall. Her wrinkled face had an anxious look, but it was also very determined. The busy, joyous Federationists and anti-Federationists, who knew her not, saw merely a stout old lady fussing forth, and those who knew her saw merely Mrs. Povey, and greeted her perfunctorily, a woman of her age and gait being rather out of place in that feverish altercation of opposed principles. But it was more than a stout old lady, it was more than Mrs. Povey, that waddled with such painful deliberation through the streets. It was a miracle. In the morning, Constance had been partially incapacitated by her sciatica, so much so, at any rate, that she had perceived the advisability of remaining on the bedroom floor instead of descending to the parlour. Therefore Mary had lighted the drawing-room fire, and Constance had ensconced herself by it, with Fossette in a basket. Lily Hall had called early, and had been very sympathetic, but rather vague. The truth was that she was concealing the imminent balloon ascent which Dick Povey, with his instinct for the picturesque, had somehow arranged in conjunction with a well-known Manchester aeronaut for the very day of the poll. That was one of the various matters that had to be kept from the old lady. Lily herself was much perturbed about the balloon ascent. She had to run off and see Dick before he started at the football ground at Bleakridge, and then she had to live through the hours till she should receive a telegram to the effect that Dick had come down safely, or that Dick had broken his leg in coming down, or that Dick was dead. It was a trying time for Lily. She had left Constance after a brief visit, with a preoccupied, unusual air, saying that as the day was a special day she would come in again if she could. And she did not forget to assure Constance that Federation would, beyond any question whatsoever, be handsomely beaten at the poll; for this was another matter as to which it was deemed advisable to keep the old lady in the dark, lest the foolish old lady should worry and commit indiscretions. After that, Constance had been forgotten by the world of Bursley, which could pay small heed to sciatical old ladies confined to sofas and firesides. She was in acute pain, as Mary could see when at intervals she hovered round her. Assuredly it was one of Constance's bad days, one of those days on which she felt that the tide of life had left her stranded in utter neglect. The sound of the Bursley Town Silver Prize Band aroused her from her mournful trance of suffering. Then the high treble of children's voices startled her. She defied her sciatica, and grimacing went to the window. And at the first glimpse she could see that the Federation poll was going to be a much more exciting affair than she had imagined. The great cards swinging from the waggonettes showed her that Federation was at all events still sufficiently alive to make a formidable impression on the eye and the ear. The square was transformed by this clamour in favour of Federation. People cheered and sang also, as the procession wound down the square, and she could distinctly catch the tramping, martial syllables: "Vote, vote, vote." She was indignant. The pother, once begun, continued. Vehicles flashed frequently across the square, most of them in the crimson livery. Little knots and processions of excited wayfarers were a recurring feature of the unaccustomed traffic, and the large majority of them flaunted the colours of Federation. Mary, after some errands of shopping, came upstairs and reported that it was simply Federation everywhere, and that Mr. Brindley, a strong Federationist, was a bit above himself. Further, that the interest in the poll was tremendous and universal. She said there were crowds and crowds round the town hall. Even Mary, generally a little placid and dull, had caught something of the contagious vivacity. Constance remained at the window till dinner, and after dinner she went to it again. It was fortunate that she did not think of looking up into the sky when Dick's balloon sailed westward. She would have guessed instantly that Dick was in that balloon, and her grievances would have been multiplied. The vast grievance of the Federation scheme weighed on her to the extremity of her power to bear. She was not a politician, she had no general ideas, she did not see the cosmic movement in large curves. She was incapable of perceiving the absurdity involved in perpetuating municipal divisions, which the growth of the district had rendered artificial, vexatious, and harmful. She saw nothing but Bursley, and in Bursley nothing but the square. She knew nothing except that the people of Bursley, who once shopped in Bursley, now shopped in Hanbridge, and that the square was a desert infested by cheapjacks, and there were actually people who wished to bow the neck to Hanbridge, who were ready to sacrifice the very name of Bursley to the greedy humour of that pushing Chicago. She could not understand such people. Did they know that poor Maria Critchlow was in a lunatic asylum because Hanbridge was so grasping? Ah, poor Maria was already forgotten. Did they know that as a further indirect consequence, she, the daughter of Bursley's chief tradesman, was to be thrown out of the house in which she was born? She wished bitterly, as she stood there at the window, watching the triumph of Federation, that she had bought the house and shop at the Merricarp sale years ago. She would have shown them, as owner, what was what. She forgot that the property which she already owned in Bursley was a continual annoyance to her, and that she was always resolving to sell it at no matter what loss. She said to herself that she had a vote, and that if she had been at all fit to stir out, she would certainly have voted. She said to herself that it had been her duty to vote. And then, by an illusion of her wrought nerves, tightened minute by minute throughout the day, she began to fancy that her sciatica was easier. She said, if only I could go out, she might have a cab, or of any of the parading vehicles would be glad to take her to the town hall, and perhaps, as a favour, to bring her back again. But no, she dared not go out. She was afraid, really afraid, that even the mild Mary might stop her. Otherwise she could have sent Mary for a cab. And supposing that Lily returned and caught her going out or coming in, she ought not to go out. Yet her sciatica was strangely better. It was folly to think of going out. Yet... And Lily did not come. She was rather hurt that Lily had not paid her a second visit. Lily was neglecting her. She would go out. It was not 4 minutes' walk for her to the town hall, and she was better. And there had been no shower for a long time, and the wind was drying the mud in the roadways. Yes, she would go. Like a thief, she passed into her bedroom and put on her things, and like a thief she crept downstairs, and so, without a word to Mary, into the street. It was a desperate adventure. As soon as she was in the street, she felt all her weakness, all the fatigue which the effort had already cost her. The pain returned. The streets were still wet and foul, the wind cold, and the sky menacing. She ought to go back. She ought to admit that she had been a fool to dream of the enterprise. The town hall seemed to be miles off, at the top of a mountain. She went forward, however, steeled to do her share in the killing of Federation. Every step caused her a gnashing of her old teeth. She chose the Cock Yard route, because if she had gone up the square she would have had to pass Hull's shop, and Lily might have spied her. This was the miracle that breezy politicians witnessed without being aware that it was a miracle. To have impressed them, Constance ought to have fainted before recording her vote, and made herself the centre of a crowd of gapers. But she managed, somehow, to reach home again on her own tortured feet, and an astounded and protesting Mary opened the door to her. Rain was descending. She was frightened then by the hardihood of her adventure, and by its atrocious results on her body. An appalling exhaustion rendered her helpless. But the deed was done. 5. The next morning, after a night which she could not have described, Constance found herself lying flat in bed, with all her limbs stretched out straight. She was conscious that her face was covered with perspiration. The bell rope hung within a foot of her head, but she had decided that, rather than move in order to pull it, She would prefer to wait for assistance until Mary came of her own accord. Her experiences of the night had given her a dread of the slightest movement. Anything was better than movement. She felt vaguely ill, with a kind of subdued pain, and she was very thirsty and somewhat cold. She knew that her left arm and leg were extraordinarily tender to the touch. When Mary at length entered, clean and fresh and pale in all her mildness, she found the mistress the colour of a duck's egg, with puffed features and a strangely anxious expression. "Mary," said Constance, "I feel so queer. Perhaps you'd better run up and tell Miss Holl and ask her to telephone for Dr. Stirling." This was the beginning of Constance's last illness. Mary most impressively informed Miss Holl that her mistress had been out on the previous afternoon in spite of her sciatica, and Lily telephoned the fact to the doctor. Lily then came down to take charge of Constance, but she dared not upbraid the invalid. "Is the result out?" Constance murmured. "Oh yes," said Lily lightly. "There's a majority of over 1200 against Federation. Great excitement last night. I told you yesterday morning that the Federation was bound to be beaten." Lily spoke as though the result throughout had been a certainty. Her tone to Constance indicated: "Surely you don't imagine that I should have told you untruths yesterday morning merely to cheer you up?" The truth was, however, that towards the end of the day nearly every one had believed Federation to be carried. The result had caused great surprise. Only the profoundest philosophers had not been surprised to see that the mere blind, deaf, inert forces of reaction, with faulty organisation and quite deprived of the age of logic, had proved far stronger than all the alert enthusiasm arrayed against them. It was a notable lesson to reformers. "Oh!" murmured Constance, startled. She was relieved, but she would have liked the majority to be smaller. Moreover, her interest in the question had lessened. It was her limbs that preoccupied her now. "You look tired," she said feebly to Lily. "Do I?" said Lily shortly, hiding the fact that she had spent half the night in tending Dick Povey, who, in a sensational descent near Macclesfield, had been dragged through the tops of a row of elm trees, to the detriment of an elbow joint. The professional aeronaut had broken a leg. Then Dr. Stirling came. "I'm afraid my sciatica's worse, Doctor," said Constance apologetically. "Did ye expect it to be better?" said he, gazing at her sternly. She knew then that someone had saved her the trouble of confessing her escapade. However, her sciatica was not worse. Her sciatica had not behaved basely. What she was suffering from was the preliminary advances of an attack of acute rheumatism. She had indeed selected the right month and weather for her escapade. Fatigued by pain, by nervous agitation, and by the immense moral and physical effort needed to carry her to the town hall and back, she had caught a chill, and had got her feet damp. In such a subject as herself it was enough. The doctor used only the phrase acute rheumatism. Constance did not know that acute rheumatism was precisely the same thing as that dread disease, rheumatic fever, and she was not informed. She did not surmise for a considerable period that her case was desperately serious. The doctor explained the summoning of 2 nurses and the frequency of his own visits by saying that his chief anxiety was to minimise the fearful pain as much as possible, and that this end could only be secured by incessant watchfulness. The pain was certainly formidable, but then Constance was well habituated to formidable pain. Sciatica, at its most active, cannot be surpassed even by rheumatic fever. Constance had been in nearly continuous pain for years. Her friends, however sympathetic, could not appreciate the intensity of her torture. They were just as used to it as she was, and the monotony and particularity of her complaints, slight though the complaints were in comparison with their cause, necessarily blunted the edge of compassion. "Mrs. Povey and her sciatica again. Poor thing, she really is a little tedious." They were apt not to realise that sciatica is even more tedious than complaints about sciatica. She asked one day that Dick should come to see her. He came with his arm in a sling, and told her charily that he had hurt his elbow through dropping his stick and slipping downstairs. "Lily never told me," said Constance suspiciously. "Oh, it's simply nothing," said Dick. Not even the sick room could chasten him of his joy in the magnificent balloon adventure. "I do hope you won't go running any risks," said Constance. "Never you fear," said he. "I shall die in my bed." And he was absolutely convinced that he would, and not as the result of any accident either. The nurse would not allow him to remain in the room. Lily suggested that Constance might like her to write to Cyril. It was only in order to make sure of Cyril's correct address. He had gone on a tour through Italy with some friends, of whom Constance knew nothing. The address appeared to be very uncertain. There were several addresses, poste restante, in various towns. Cyril had sent postcards to his mother. Dick and Lily went to the post office and telegraphed to foreign parts. Though Constance was too ill to know how ill she was, though she had no conception of the domestic confusion caused by her illness, her brain was often remarkably clear, and she could reflect in long sane meditations above the uneasy sea of her pain. In the early hours of the night, after the nurses had been changed, and Mary had gone to bed, exhausted with stair climbing, and Lily Hall was recounting the day to Dick up at the grocer's, and the day nurse was already asleep, and the night nurse had arranged the night, then, in the faintly lit silence of the chamber, Constance would argue with herself for an hour at a time. She frequently thought of Sophia. In spite of the fact that Sophia was dead, she still pitied Sophia as a woman whose life had been wasted. This idea of Sophia's wasted and sterile life, and of the far-reaching importance of adhering to principles, recurred to her again and again. Why did she run away with him? If only she had not run away, she would repeat. And yet there had been something so fine about Sophia, which made Sophia's case all the more pitiable. Constance never pitied herself. She did not consider that fate had treated her very badly. She was not very discontented with herself. The invincible common sense of a sound nature prevented her, in her best moments, from feebly dissolving in self-pity. She had lived in honesty and kindliness for a fair number of years, and she had tasted triumphant hours. She was justly respected. She had a position. She had dignity. She was well off. She possessed, after all, a certain amount of quiet self-conceit. There existed nobody to whom she would knuckle down, or could be asked to knuckle down. True, she was old. So were thousands of other people in Bursley. She was in pain. So there were thousands of other people. With whom would she be willing to exchange lots? She had many dissatisfactions, but she rose superior to them. When she surveyed her life, and life in general, she would think, with a sort of tart but not sour cheerfulness, well, that is what life is. Despite her habit of complaining about domestic trifles, she was, in the essence of her character, a great body for making the best of things. Thus she did not unduly bewail her excursion to the town hall to vote, which the sequel had proved to be ludicrously supererogatory. "How was I to know?" she said. The one matter in which she had gravely to reproach herself was her indulgent spoiling of Cyril after the death of Samuel Povey. But the end of her reproaches always was, "I expect I should do the same again, and probably it wouldn't have made any difference if I hadn't spoiled him." And she had paid tenfold for the weakness. She loved Cyril, but she had no illusions about him. She saw both sides of him. She remembered all the sadness and all the humiliations which he had caused her. Still, her affection was unimpaired. Her son might be worse than Cyril was. He had admirable qualities. She did not resent his being away from England while she lay ill. If it was serious, she said, he would not lose a moment. And Lily and Dick were a treasure to her. In those two she really had been lucky. She took great pleasure in contemplating the splendour of the gift with which she would mark her appreciation of them at their approaching wedding. The secret attitude of both of them towards her was one of good-natured condescension, expressed in the tone in which they would say to each other, "The old lady." Perhaps they would have been startled to know that Constance lovingly looked down on both of them. She had an unbounded admiration for their hearts, but she thought that Dick was a little too brusque, a little too clownish to be quite a gentleman. And though Lily was perfectly ladylike, in Constance's opinion she lacked backbone, or grit, or independence of spirit. Further, Constance considered that the disparity of age between them was excessive. It is to be doubted whether, when all was said, Constance had such a very great deal to learn from the self-confident wisdom of these young things. After a period of self-communion, she would sometimes fall into a shallow delirium. In all her delirium she was invariably wandering to and fro, lost in the long underground passage leading from the scullery past the coal cellar and the cinder cellar to the back yard, and she was afraid of the vast obscure of those regions, as she had been in her infancy. It was not acute rheumatism, but a supervening pericarditis that in a few days killed her. She died in the night, alone with the night nurse. By curious chance, the Wesleyan minister, hearing that she was seriously ill, had called on the previous day. She had not asked for him, and this pastoral visit, from a man who had always said that the heavy duties of the circuit rendered pastoral visits almost impossible, made her think. In the evening she had requested that Fawcett should be brought upstairs. Thus she was turned out of her house, but not by the Midland Clothiers Company. Old people said to one another, "Have you heard that Mrs. Povey is dead? Dear me, there'll be no one left soon." These old people were bad prophets. Her friends genuinely regretted her, and forgot the tediousness of her sciatica. They tried, in their sympathetic grief, to picture to themselves all that she had been through in her life. Possibly they imagined that they succeeded in this imaginative attempt, but they did not succeed. No one but Constance could realise all that Constance had been through, and all that life had meant to her. Cyril was not at the funeral. He arrived 3 days later. As he had no interest in the love affairs of Dick and Lily, the couple were robbed of their wedding present. The will, 15 years old, was in Cyril's favour. But the immortal Charles Critchlow came to the funeral, full of calm, sardonic glee, and without being asked. Though fabulously senile, he had preserved and even improved his faculty for enjoying a catastrophe. He now went to funerals with gusto, contentedly absorbed in the task of burying his friends one by one. It was he who said, in his high, trembling, rasping, deliberate voice, "It's a pity her didn't live long enough to hear as Federation is going on after all. That would have worrited her." For the unscrupulous advocates of Federation had discovered a method of setting at naught the decisive result of the referendum, and that day's Signal was fuller than ever of Federation. When the short funeral procession started, Mary and the infirm Fawcett, sole relic of the connection between the Baines family and Paris, were left alone in the house. The tearful servant prepared the dog's dinner, and laid it before her in the customary soup plate in the customary corner. Fawcett sniffed at it, and then walked away and lay down with a dog's sigh in front of the kitchen fire. She had been deranged in her habits that day. She was conscious of neglect due to events which passed her comprehension, and she did not like it. She was hurt, and her appetite was hurt. However, after a few minutes, she began to reconsider the matter. She glanced at the soup plate, and on the chance that it might, after all, contain something worth inspection, she awkwardly balanced herself on her old legs and went to it again. End of Chapter 5 of Book 4 and of The Old Wives' Tale. Read by Andy Minter in Willstone, Hertfordshire, England, June 2008.